The prison had no walls. That was the first thing Daniel Cole noticed. No bars, no guards, no locked doors. He woke up in the same apartment he had lived in for 6 years. Sunlight spilling through the blinds, traffic humming below. Everything looked normal. Nothing worked. At 7:11 a.m., Daniel tried to unlock his phone. The screen froze, then displayed a message he had never seen before. Access restricted. He assumed it was a software error. He restarted the device. The same message returned, accompanied by a prompt instructing him to contact his service provider. When he reached for his laptop, the login screen rejected his credentials. The password he had used for years no longer registered. His email client opened but failed to sync. Messages sat unsent, queued endlessly. By 7:28 a.m., his banking app refused to load. Daniel was 39 years old, a civil engineer living in Manchester. No criminal record, no outstanding debts, no history of political activism. He worked on infrastructure projects, paid taxes, lived quietly. If anyone existed safely inside the system, it was him. At least, he thought he did. When Daniel attempted to call his mobile provider, the automated line informed him that his account was under compliance review and disconnected. He tried again. Same result. When he walked to the cafe downstairs, the payment terminal declined his card without explanation. The barista apologized awkwardly, assuming it was a temporary issue. Daniel left without coffee. On the bus ride to work, his transit pass failed to scan. The driver waved him through, irritated but unconcerned. At his office building, the access gate did not open. A security guard scanned Daniel's badge twice before frowning. "You're not cleared today," the guard said. "Must be an admin issue." Daniel laughed nervously and stepped aside to make room for the next person. He waited for someone from HR to come down. No one did. By noon, Daniel understood that this was not a technical problem. Every attempt to interact with system, financial, professional, digital, ended the same way. Access denied. Review pending. No timeline. No explanation. At 1:02 p.m., a notification appeared on his laptop. Plain text. No branding. Status update. Subject: Cole Daniel. Restriction level: Tier 4. Mobility, financial, and digital access limited. Duration: indefinite. He stared at the screen, waiting for the rest to load. Nothing did. Daniel had not been arrested. He had not been charged. He had not been sentenced. But his life had been narrowed. That afternoon, he walked into a police station. The officer behind the desk listened politely as Daniel explained that he believed he had been mistakenly flagged by some system. The officer entered Daniel's details into the terminal. The screen paused longer than usual, then displayed a status message the officer had never seen before. Subject under administrative restriction. No action required. The officer tried again. Same result. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "There's nothing for us to act on." Daniel asked who had issued the restriction. The officer shook his head. "It doesn't say." Daniel left the station feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because no crime had been alleged. Heavier because no one was responsible. Over the next week, the invisible prison closed in. His employer suspended him pending compliance clarification. His health portal restricted appointment booking. His rental agreement triggered a verification review. Automated systems continued functioning, but not for him. They treated him as a liability that required containment. Daniel tried to survive offline. He paid cash where he could, walked instead of taking transport, borrowed a neighbor's phone to contact family. But even human help began to fail because humans relied on systems. Forms needed accounts. Appointments required verification. Assistants demanded credentials. Everything demanded proof that Daniel no longer possessed. Late one night, unable to sleep, Daniel searched the phrase Tier 4 restriction using a public library computer. Buried deep in an obscure forum, he found others, people who had not been arrested but had been restricted, people who had not been convicted but had been contained, people who described the same pattern. Gradual loss of access, no appeal, no authority to confront. Someone had named it, the invisible prison. The post suggested that the restrictions were part of a broader administrative framework used by governments, financial institutions, and platforms to manage risk exposure. The system did not require guilt. It required probability. If a person's profile crossed enough internal thresholds, irregular income, data inconsistencies, flagged associations, access could be quietly limited to protect the system from potential future harm. No trial was necessary. The punishment was preemptive. Daniel scrolled through testimonies until dawn. Stories from different countries, different languages, same outcome. People trapped in lives that still existed physically but no longer functioned digitally. Some had lived like that for years. One post ended with a sentence that stayed with him. "You're not jailed. You're paused." As Daniel read, he realized the most terrifying part was not the restriction itself. It was the absence of an exit. No appeals process, no timeline, no human decision-maker. The system did not punish behavior. It managed risk. And once you were categorized as risk, you were no longer a person. You were a variable. By the end of the month, Daniel's savings were gone. Friends helped where they could, but support frayed as the situation dragged on. People assumed he had done something wrong. The system's silence became its own accusation. Daniel had not been locked up. He had been locked out. And somewhere deep inside networks he could not see or challenge, his profile remained active, monitored, restricted, and waiting in a prison without walls, without guards, and without a sentence end date. By the second month, Daniel Cole understood that the restriction was not temporary. Temporary problems came with timelines. Reviews had reference numbers. Even denials implied someone had looked. What surrounded Daniel now was something quieter, a state of suspension that felt permanent because nothing pushed against it. Every morning began the same way. He woke up early out of habit, checked a phone that no longer connected, and sat at the small kitchen table watching the city wake up without him. He still lived in Manchester. He still occupied space. But the systems that made life possible behaved as if he were a ghost passing through them. He tried everything that still felt reasonable. Letters to banks, emails to regulators, online forms submitted from borrowed devices. Each attempt ended in the same response, acknowledgement without action. "Thank you for your inquiry. Your request has been logged. Please allow additional time." Time became the currency the system demanded most. Daniel learned quickly that access did not disappear all at once. It thinned. It degraded. One day, he could book an appointment but not confirm it. The next day, he could see options but not select them. Eventually, the interfaces themselves stopped appearing. Doors didn't slam shut. They faded. What frightened him most was how normal it all looked from the outside. Friends invited him out less often, not because they stopped caring, but because he always declined. He couldn't pay easily. He couldn't travel easily. He couldn't explain what was happening without sounding evasive. People began to fill the silence with assumptions. Someone joked that he must be on a list. Someone else laughed and said those didn't exist. Daniel stopped correcting them. Late one night at the library, Daniel returned to the forum where he had first seen the phrase "the invisible prison." He read everything he could find, scrolling through years of archive posts written by people who had lost access long before he had. Some described sanctions related to financial compliance. Others mentioned algorithmic risk flags triggered by data mismatches no one could identify. The details differed. The outcome never did. People described lives reduced to narrow corridors, jobs lost quietly, travel blocked without explanation, healthcare delayed indefinitely. Some wrote about appeals that went nowhere. Others said they had been told, unofficially, that pushing too hard only extended the restriction. The system did not respond to protest. It responded to compliance. That was when Daniel noticed something new. Several users mentioned tiers. Tier 1, monitoring. Tier 2, friction. Tier 3, partial restriction. Tier 4, containment. Daniel was Tier 4. The post suggested that Tier 4 did not mean danger. It meant uncertainty. Profiles that could not be confidently categorized were isolated to prevent potential disruption. The system wasn't accusing them of wrongdoing. It was postponing trust. Indefinitely. The deeper Daniel read, the clearer it became that no single authority controlled the invisible prison. It existed at the intersection of governments, banks, insurers, platforms, and compliance frameworks that shared data quietly. Each system trusted the others enough to defer responsibility. No one owned the restriction. Everyone enforced it. Daniel tried to live smaller. He sold furniture for cash, moved into a cheaper flat where the landlord accepted rent in person. He avoided hospitals, avoided airports, avoided anything that required identity verification. His world shrank to what could be negotiated face-to-face. Even that became difficult. One afternoon, he was stopped by a transit officer during a routine ticket check. Daniel explained that his pass no longer worked and that he was paying cash where possible. The officer scanned Daniel's ID card. The handheld device paused, then returned a neutral message. Administrative status confirmed. The officer handed the card back without comment and moved on. That was the moment Daniel realized how complete the system was. He wasn't being hunted. He was being managed. Across the city, other people were learning the same lesson. A nurse who could no longer renew her license. A delivery driver whose route assignments vanished. A graduate student whose visa status slipped into review and never returned. They found each other slowly through the same forums, the same library computers, the same careful conversations that avoided keywords known to trigger monitoring. They compared notes, dates, screenshots, status messages. Patterns emerged. Many had experienced data inconsistencies months before restriction. A mismatch between addresses, duplicate records, flags they never saw. The system treated ambiguity as risk, and risk as something to be contained. None of them had been convicted of anything. None of them could find human authority who could reverse it. One user described the system as a quarantine for uncertainty. Daniel understood that description immediately. As months passed, pressure mounted behind scenes. Journalists began asking questions about digital restrictions and algorithmic governance. Lawmakers held hearings about automated compliance systems. Banks issued statements about transparency and fairness. Nothing changed for the people already inside. Daniel's profile remained restricted. No review date appeared. No appeal succeeded. The system did not escalate him further, but it did not release him either. He was stable, contained. One evening, Daniel received a message through the forum. A user claimed to have worked on a compliance platform years earlier. The message was brief. Tier 4 cases don't expire. They dissolve only if the system changes. Daniel read it several times. The implication was devastating. The invisible prison was not designed to end sentences. It was designed to reduce uncertainty. And uncertainty, once isolated, did not require release. Daniel closed the library computer as the lights dimmed. Outside, the city moved efficiently. Trains arrived on time. Payments processed instantly. Systems worked beautifully. As long as you were trusted, Daniel walked home slowly, understanding now that his life was not broken. It had been optimized out. By the time Daniel Cole understood how the invisible prison ended, he realized that most people inside it never reached that point. They simply disappeared from relevance. The system did not escalate them, punish them further, or close their cases. It let them remain suspended long enough that their absence stopped registering as a problem. Employers moved on. Friends adjusted. Records aged out. Life reorganized itself around the empty space they left behind. The prison did not need walls because time did the work. Daniel learned this slowly, through fragments shared by others like him. People who had been restricted for years described a strange pattern. After long periods of stability, no appeals, no complaints, no noise, their profiles changed. Not visibly, not officially, just enough to reduce friction. A bank card suddenly worked again. A login succeeded without explanation. A form submitted without error. No message ever arrived saying the restriction had ended. It simply loosened. The system, it seemed, did not reward innocence. It rewarded predictability. As journalists and advocacy groups continued pushing for transparency, public attention moved on. New scandals emerged. New fears replaced old ones. Hearings stalled. Promises of reform faded into committee language and budget discussions. Behind the scenes, compliance systems were quietly adjusted, thresholds raised, flags reweighted. Some restrictions expired not because anyone intervened, but because the models recalibrated. Risk profiles decayed. Daniel noticed the first change when his phone reconnected to the network after months of silence. There was no alert, no apology. One moment it didn't work. The next, it did. A week later, his bank app loaded. He didn't celebrate. He waited. Experience had taught him that trust came with conditions. Over the following weeks, more access returned in pieces. Not everything. Never everything. His employment record remained marked. His credit history carried scars. Travel permissions still failed intermittently. But the prison door, if it could be called that, had opened just enough for him to step outside. Others were not as lucky. In the forum, Daniel watched names stop posting. Some users announced small victories and vanished. Others simply went silent, their last messages unresolved questions that never received replies. The invisible prison did not release everyone. It released enough. That was the system's final lesson. As long as most people regained partial function, outrage dissipated. As long as the machine appeared capable of correction, scrutiny softened. The cost of those who never returned became invisible. Daniel tried to rebuild his life carefully. He found contract work that paid in cash. Eventually, a company took a chance on him after a manual review. It required explanations he could not fully give. He learned to speak in vague terms, compliance issues, administrative delays, resolved internally. People accepted those phrases because they wanted to. No one wanted to believe the alternative. Years later, an internal report surfaced quietly, buried in a policy archive few people read. It summarized the invisible prison in neutral language. It praised the system's ability to reduce systemic uncertainty. It acknowledged unintended consequences without naming victims. One sentence stood out. Containment mechanisms are preferable to adjudication when future risk cannot be reliably assessed. Daniel read it once and closed the document. He understood now that the invisible prison had never been about justice or punishment. It was about risk management in a world that feared unpredictability more than cruelty. The system did not ask whether people deserved restriction. It asked whether releasing them would complicate things. The truth was simpler and darker than Daniel had imagined at the beginning. No one had targeted him. No one had decided he was dangerous. The system had simply reached a moment where it could not confidently say he was safe. And that was enough. As cities continued expanding digital governance, the invisible prison was never officially dismantled. It evolved, renamed, softened in language, distributed across frameworks that promised fairness while quietly preserving control. People like Daniel became case studies, not warnings. Their suffering was categorized as acceptable friction. Years later, Daniel stood on a busy street, watching people move through turnstile scanners and gates without hesitation. He saw how effortlessly life flowed when systems trusted you, how invisible the infrastructure was when it worked. He wondered how many people around him were one threshold away from the same silence he had endured. How many lives depended not on innocence, but on clarity. How many futures were waiting to be paused. The invisible prison had no memorial, no records etched in stone, just profiles archived quietly, restrictions softened over time, and lessons absorbed by machines that never forgot. Daniel walked away knowing something few others did. Freedom had not been restored. It had been conditionally reissued. And the only reason he was standing outside the prison now was because the system had decided, eventually, that he no longer mattered enough to contain.